Tēnā koutou katoa. I am Jo Kelly, Chief Executive of the Centre for Sustainable Finance. As you will be aware from previous webinars, the Centre convened an independent technical advisory group, or ITAG, to make recommendations to the Climate Change Minister on key design elements of a New Zealand sustainable finance, or green taxonomy. Welcome, and I'm pleased to be joined today by members of the ITAG who will respond to the questions we've received since last week's webinar, where we provided an overview of those draft recommendations. The ITAG is made up of technical experts, subject matter experts, and financial market participants. In convening this group, the Centre was looking to achieve a cross-section of the potential users of the taxonomy, Māori finance expertise, and credible subject matter experts. The ITAG is a formal decision-making group, but its role is confined to this set of recommendations. Both its role and composition may be reviewed for the future phases of the New Zealand taxonomy, should the government decide to proceed. The recommendations set forward by the ITAG were developed through a series of online meetings led by the Centre and the Climate Bonds Initiative from January to April this year, and they cover the following 10 main topics: principles, purpose, objectives, sector prioritisation, definitions, usability, application, eligibility, transition, and governance. Last week, ITAG members provided a summary of their recommendations, which are provided in full in the draft report published at sustainablefinanced.nz/taxonomy recommendations. You can view a recording of that session, that webinar session, at that same link on our website. Today, we're going to address questions that came up during our first stakeholder webinar last week and those received through the Taxonomy Secretariat email address. You're welcome to submit additional questions as they arise today. The speakers can't see your questions and won't be able to respond directly during this webinar, but the Secretariat will endeavour to respond to you directly via email. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Caroline Pojul, Director of Sustainable Finance for ANZ, George Wayman, Manager of ESG Research at Harbour Asset Management, Fontaine Moses-Takani, Hokiaki and Director of Māori Strategy and Indigenous Inclusion for Westpac New Zealand, and James Patterson, Head of Sustainable Finance for ASB. I'll briefly recap the Webinar 1 poll results, and we'll then hand over to Caroline to get us started with the audience questions. Thank you to those audience members today who participated in the live polls during last week's webinar. Overall, we found strong agreement or endorsement of the recommendations from the 30 or so people who responded during the webinar. These results do not reflect the survey responses received separately since then on our website. We will cover most of these recommendations shown here as we go through today's discussion. I would also like to draw your attention specifically to the poll on governance, which we'll also cover more today during the discussion. This poll asked whether respondents agree that the taxonomy should be government-backed, but developed by experts with safeguards against political and industry interference. As you can see, there was a lot of support for that approach. I'll now hand over to Caroline to start taking us through the questions we've received from the audience.
Thank you, Jo. Good afternoon. My name is Caroline Pujol. I'm a director in the Sustainable Finance team at ANZ. The questions I'll respond to are: question 1, is green finance really addressing the problem of overconsumption, which is the cause of climate change? Or is it not simply a way to further drive consumption? And question 2, how will ordinary citizens benefit from this? These both speak to the purpose of the taxonomy, and I will focus on the purpose and principles recommendations of the ITAG. The point about overconsumption being the core problem is well taken. The ITAG did discuss the potential unintended consequence of making consumption more efficient and less costly, thereby encouraging more of it. We spoke at great length about the purpose statement with each word carefully examined by the group. The taxonomy is not the only tool we need to address the root causes of climate change, but does provide a credible framework for understanding economic activities that are aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement and other objectives, including restoring nature. Taxonomies are being developed in more than 40 jurisdictions now. So for New Zealand, it's also about making international definitions fit for purpose in our context. It's important to note that as New Zealand is an importer of capital, these definitions will to some degree be imposed on us by other jurisdictions. While taxonomies or classifications don't provide the whole answer, they are important tools that financial institutions and governments can use today to direct capital towards outcomes that are more sustainable. It's not ideal to have these defined by individual organizations, because we do need a common language and approach. We hope this will reduce friction and increase the pace and scale of capital flowing towards better outcomes. As for the relationship between growth and green finance, which question 1 also underlines, the ITAG has recommended key principles to guide the taxonomy, and I will highlight 2 here. The first is credibility, which includes ensuring the taxonomy is based on evidence and international best practices and standards. It also includes transparency in its governance structure, and in particular, how the technical screening criteria are designed to give effect to the taxonomy's purpose. The second is culture, Aotearoa. This is an acknowledgement that human society depends on nature, and nature is not seen simply in monetary terms. But including indigenous knowledge and culture as a principle, we are allowing for considerations of those deeper issues. Moving on to the question about the benefits to citizens. Primary users of taxonomies tend to be financial institutions, regulatory agencies, and corporates, but there are clear flow-through benefits for consumers and individuals. These include helping to avoid greenwashing by providing a common language on what is a green or a transition activity, which then can be used to label products. Giving the government definitions that they can follow to incentivize taxonomy-aligned tax activities. Providing definitions that are recognizable and credible to international investors, and enabling the flow of green capital. Showing alignment to regulations and standards that are already in place with key trading partners. Finally, helping to clarify New Zealand's sustainability story and credentials, and helping to operationalize our international commitments to the Paris Agreement. Does it make rich institutions feel better about themselves? We haven't focused on how financial institutions feel about it. We do know that some of our largest financial institutions already have their own internal taxonomies that they are applying to lending decisions. And they have advocated through the Sustainable Finance Forum and CSA for a common, transparent framework that builds on the definitions that are already in use. I'll hand over to George for some questions about governance.
Thanks, Carolyn. So my name is George Wyman, Manager of ESG Research here at Harbour Asset Management. So questions 3, 4, and 5 relate to the credibility and governance of the taxonomy. These are, firstly, how have iwi/Māori been included in the prioritisation of issues? Secondly, how will tangata whenua be included in taxonomy design? And thirdly, how will we avoid the politicisation that's happened in the EU? I'll start with the first question as that relates to the current ITAG and the phase we're in now. So the ITAG has 19 members, of which 4 are temporary members, such as a representative of the Sustainable Business Council, who attended meetings relevant to their specific area of focus. The current ITAG members, including those of us speaking today, were invited by the Centre for Sustainable Finance based on prior experience developing or applying sustainable finance taxonomies or other similar policy regulation and tools, the ability to draw on the institutional knowledge and expertise of our organisations and professional networks, and also to achieve a balanced representation from different parts of the financial system to ensure diversity within the group. In developing these draft recommendations, the ITAG was guided by senior Māori finance professionals Te Moera Hall, who has developed an Indigenous-led ESG framework, Fontaine Moses Tekani, who also represents a financial institution, and June McCabe, who is the Potahua representative of the National Iwi Chairs Forum. Related to the other two questions, how will tangata whenua be included in taxonomy design, and how will we avoid the politicisation that happened in the EU? So we did consider existing models, including those of the EU, China, ASEAN, Japan, Australia, and Canada, which cover a range of approaches from government-led to industry-led. We also have experience here in New Zealand with the Sustainable Agriculture Finance Initiative, which is an industry-led framework that was developed in collaboration with MPI. The ITAG has recommended that a robust governance structure is key to ensuring credibility and integrity in the taxonomy. We think the governance model of the taxonomy should safeguard the transparency and scientific rigor of the way the criteria are designed, as well as ensuring that the taxonomy is maintained and periodically updated. We are recommending a 3-tier model, as shown here, which is very close to the Australian approach. The key difference being we are recommending iwi and Māori are represented at all 3 tiers. Starting at the bottom blue, tier 3, this is where the criteria are designed. These groups consist of academics, scientists, and subject matter experts to ensure the scientific rigor and integrity of the technical screening criteria. Tier 2 is where you would expect to see higher representation from the financial institutions to provide feedback on usability and to endorse the criteria that are proposed. This tier also serves as an important coordinating function between tier 1 and 3. Tier 1 is the government, which either accepts or declines to endorse the process rather than to evaluate the quality of the criteria developed by tiers 2 and 3. There are also other measures we are recommending, such as ensuring regular, clear responsibilities and clear communication between tiers, public consultation, and separating the source of government funding, which will likely come from an agency from the Tier 1 group, which is part of the process. In Australia, for example, the Tier 1 group is led by the Climate Group of the Australian Council of Financial Regulators. In terms of resourcing, this has not yet been decided for any tier. Internationally, these groups tend to be voluntary, and in Australia, they have been formed through a public expressions of interest process led by the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, which is similar to the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Finance. I'll now pass on to Fontaine at Westpac.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Fontaine Moses Tekani toko ingoa. I am the Potaki Director of Māori Strategy and Indigenous Inclusion at Westpac New Zealand. The question I'll answer is, why is there such a large representation of finance expertise on the ITAG? and this relates to our recommendations on usability and application. Taxonomies are basically tools to help investors and companies to make informed investment decisions on environmentally sustainable activities. For New Zealand, the ITAG has gone further by including the words mobilise and affect and direct capital in the purpose statement. Taxonomies tend to be used by financial market participants, corporates and regulators, people who are making capital allocation decisions. The ITAG has made recommendations on both usability and application. Usability means how well a taxonomy can be applied and integrated into a market. How practical are the criteria to measure and report on, and how practical are the reporting requirements? If the taxonomy is mandatory, as it is in Europe, then usability can be seen as less critical because you just have to do it. If it is voluntary, as we are recommending initially for New Zealand, the simplicity and technical usability of the taxonomy become key drivers of its take-up. Application relates to who uses it and what they use it for, like defining what's green in a bond or financial product, supporting corporate disclosures, or using it as a government policy tool. We recommend that the taxonomy is suitable for a range of different users, not just debt markets. We also recommend that it connects to existing standards and reporting requirements, so we have time to develop capacity and data that can be used to determine taxonomy alignment. To specifically answer the question of why there is a weighting of finance expertise, it's because we need to make a tool that is usable in and by the finance sector. This does not need to be balanced with the input of scientists or academics or experts who will ensure its credibility. That is why there is a strong recommendations around 3 governance tiers where the criteria are designed by experts. A middle tier endorsed it for usability, and then the process is accepted or not by that tier 1 government group. I'll now pass to James Patterson to talk about priority sectors.
Thanks, Fontaine. Kia ora. I'm James Patterson, Head of Sustainable Finance at ASB. Questions 7, 8 and 9 relate to the sectors that we've prioritised, and specifically why our largest emitting sectors were prioritised by the ITAG, why we need a taxonomy to tell us that our agriculture is the most efficient in the world, and whether there are already criteria in existence for agriculture. I'll start with the sector prioritisation and then talk about agriculture. Most countries prioritise sectors that are most relevant to their economy. For our recommendations, the ITAD looked at a range of factors which are outlined here, the last of which, number 14, relates to the question of why we prioritise the highest emitting sectors. This is and has the potential impact or scale of the change available in the sector. Given there will be finite time and resources to help develop the taxonomy, we put quite a lot of time and weighting to areas of the economies where sustainable finance can make a big difference. These are sectors that are key to our transition, our trade agreements, offshore relationships, and our international reputation, amongst the other 13 factors listed here. There was full consensus in the ITAG that agriculture, forestry, and fisheries are among the top 3 sectors that New Zealand should prioritise. Credibly defining what we mean by sustainable agriculture will potentially further strengthen New Zealand's position internationally. But taxonomies don't only look at how we perform relative to other countries, they look at how aligned the activities are within the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement and how the other environmental objectives and minimum social safeguards we are pursuing. In New Zealand, banks are already using the SAFI guidance to make lending decisions and to develop incentive-based products for our agriculture customers. The SAFI guidance covers practices to reduce emissions, improve long-term resilience, and deliver more sustainable outcomes in terms of water, waste, pollution, and ecosystems. By prioritising agriculture for the taxonomy, we add international credibility and a greater degree of rigour to the guidance that's already in use. The group that designed and used the SAFI has been consulted as part of the ITAG recommendation process. In terms of global coverage of agriculture, forestry and fishing, they aren't covered as thoroughly as other sectors, but there are some attempts to establish criteria. There's a real opportunity for New Zealand to be influential here if we move quickly. Singapore has criteria for agriculture. Australia is in the planning stages. CBI is updating their guidelines, and China is currently developing an agriculture framework. All are keen to collaborate and learn from other jurisdictions, but New Zealand has not yet been actively participating in the discussions. I'm now going to pass back to Carolyn to talk about another aspect related to agriculture, which is adaptation and resilience.
Thank you, James. So this question relates to our objectives and why we have recommended to prioritize climate change mitigation over adaptation. A taxonomy's objectives are a key part of its interoperability. In making the recommendation on objectives, we discussed a range of considerations, including environmental objectives across other jurisdictions, and where there is already information or work we can draw on. The prioritization and sequencing of work is important as we want to move quickly, and the development of criteria for some environmental objectives will be slower than others. Climate change mitigation is generally the most common environmental objective because it is easier to determine the substantial contribution that economic activities make to it, and there are accepted existing best practices and already defined criteria and thresholds. We agree that adaptation and resilience is a priority objective for us in New Zealand. There is still a lack of international consensus around what substantial contribution to adaptation and resilience actually means, because it is very localized. We recommend a focus on mitigation as a priority, and then adaptation and resilience to follow as the taxonomies develop internationally. George and James will now talk about eligibility and transition.
So questions 11 and 12 relate to eligibility and transition. How will the taxonomy decide which non-zero emissions activities should be labelled as green, and why do we need a transition category? I'll speak about eligibility and then James will cover transition. So an activity can be aligned with a taxonomy in 3 different ways. First, the activity provides substantial contribution to one of the environmental objectives of the taxonomy. Secondly, if it's an enabling activity, it might not substantially contribute to one of the environmental objectives per se, but it is critical to enable other activities to substantially contribute. For instance, the manufacturing of electric batteries has a relatively high level of greenhouse gas emissions throughout its life cycle analysis, but it enables other economic activities to decarbonize, such as electric vehicles. According to the EU taxonomy, the benefit that is enabled must be larger than the impact of the enabling activity. Thirdly, transition. This is an activity for which there is currently no feasible low carbon alternative and is therefore not currently aligned with the taxonomy's objectives, but can support the transition by being decarbonized along a science-based pathway as technologies are developed. There are 3 different formats of the criteria to determine eligibility. Technical screening criteria are generally numerical thresholds that enable a binary assessment. The activity either meets the threshold or it does not. These are relatively easy to use and allow very little room for interpretation. So in practice, they reduce the risk of greenwashing. However, they tend to be more data intensive. Whitelists are lists of automatically aligned technologies or measures that are prescribed by the taxonomy. They tend to be very easy criteria to use, when data availability is a hurdle, because the deployment of those technologies essentially act as a proxy for decarbonisation. Then there is principles-based, which tend to be quite high level and not very prescriptive. This allows flexibility, but can leave a lot of room for interpretation to the end user, and may easily allow for greenwashing and inconsistency of application. Moving to the next slide. So for New Zealand, we have not yet determined exactly how the taxonomy will decide which net zero emissions activities should be labelled green. We are recommending to adopt an alignment approach based on technical screening criteria that are binary, credible, and internationally recognised. We recommend that these can be complemented by whitelists where necessary. We are not recommending a principles-based approach. James, over to you.
Thanks, George. In terms of why we need a transition category, our recommendation is to focus on defining green as a priority, but also to consider the use of a separate transition category that allows capital providers to incentivise customers that are making progress. This is already happening in New Zealand, and investors and banks are already making our own internal assessments of activities and whether they are transition or green or not. The ITAG recommends that transition should encourage substantial movements towards a 1.5 degree pathway for a defined and limited list of sectors and activities that are material and relevant to Aotearoa New Zealand, and that this transition category should be for activities within a predetermined period of time. Globally, Australia and Singapore are including transition categories, and whilst the EU does not explicitly label activities as transitional, it does use a best-in-class approach for activities where low-carbon alternatives are not widely available. An example of that would be in cement manufacturing. This is done in practice by identifying the top 10 or 15% of the best available performers within a sector or activity, and then using the GHG emissions level as a baseline, drawing a trajectory towards zero by a specific sunset date. And a sunset date in this context is the point after which the activity is either aligned within the green category or it becomes ineligible or excluded. Just moving to the next slide. We also recommend considering a traffic light system to label transitioning activities that's based on robust methodology to ensure that any transition category or label is used to drive material step changes to emissions beyond business as usual. Traffic light systems are essentially where things are labelled green, amber or red, with the amber activities either moving rapidly towards green transition pathway within the sunset date, or encouraging significant short-term GHG emissions reductions within a specific sunset date. With that, I will pass back over to Fontaine.
Kia ora. Our final question today is, can science tell us what an appropriate green investment is in an individual country? Global science brings us invaluable data and insights, but it doesn't always provide solutions that fit local needs. Here in Aotearoa, factors like societal and cultural values, policy and economic priorities will also shape our definition of appropriate green investments. While we certainly can and should use science to inform our decisions, we also acknowledge that these decisions are influenced by our values and moral judgments. As a group, we also discussed that under the Paris Agreement, countries have different responsibilities. Science can't dictate what an appropriate threshold for New Zealand should be to contribute its fair share to the global effort, and simply matching the global averages would set the bar too low for a developed country like New Zealand and could be seen as incompatible with our Paris Agreement commitments. Our recommendation is to align to science where we can and to draw on various perspectives of technical advisory groups. That's tier 3 in our governance model. This will help to ensure the credibility of the taxonomy and foster a range of views about what is appropriate for our context. Kia ora, handing over to you, Jo, to close us out.
Thanks, Fontaine. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Sorry about the phone call in the background as well. Your questions are valuable, and we do look forward to receiving your further comments and questions via our email or the survey on our website. That address again is sustainablefinance.nz/taxonomy recommendations. Once again, the feedback period for this phase closes on the 5th of May at 12 p.m. Please do complete the survey at your earliest convenience, and we do look forward to hearing from you before we finalise the recommendations and present them to the Minister, who will then need to make a decision about how to proceed. Thank you everyone for your time, and thanks again to our speakers today. Ka kite anō.